G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Pole Position, our fortnightly show where we unpack the latest results from the Guardian Essential Poll Report. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've had, I think, upwards of 1,500 people RSVP, so it should be a bit of a cracking one today. Obviously, people are keen to talk about politics. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Obviously, the days and times do vary for these webinars, so head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find all our latest research, as well as to sign up for future webinars. This is our penultimate pole position. We've got one more in 2 weeks' time. And then we'll be wrapping up pole position for the year until the new year, but plenty to talk about before then. Just a reminder, if you're joining us for the first time, a few tips to make things run easier today. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions, upvote people's questions, and comment on other people's questions. A chat box where you can enter the chat. Please keep things civil and on topic, or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded. So thank you so much for joining us today. I want to welcome our regular panelists, Katharine Murphy, political editor at Guardian Australia, Pete Lewis and John Remmington from Essential. And as always, it's been a big fortnight in politics. We're in the last couple of sitting weeks of the year, and shenanigans have broken out like they normally do. We've got government senators crossing the floor to support Pauline Hanson's legislation in the Senate, and all sorts of other things happening all over the place. Katharine Murphy, you're back from Glasgow. I don't think we've spoken to you since then. There's always a lot happening in politics, but we really are trying to cram a lot into these last couple of sitting weeks.
Yeah, she's going to end with a bang, I think, this year, which, and apologies to regular pole position attendees that I've been absent. I've been in Glasgow and basically overrun by events. So anyway, it's good to be back with you all today. And as Eb says, yes, it's all happening. Just as well, we had 5 senators cross the floor yesterday to support Pauline Hanson's bill because she couldn't vote for her own legislation because she wasn't in the parliament. Anyway, sort of apart from that high farce, yes, look, in the final 2 sitting weeks, we've got a debate now rolling through the government about some of Scott Morrison's legacy, really, during the pandemic. Obviously, there's a mood in the government to project this idea of freedom and personal responsibility and the end of restrictions, which of course accords with fatigue in the community about 2 years of pandemic and lockdowns and all of that sort of stuff. But obviously the coalition is very concerned about a bleed of votes to protest parties, including One Nation and Clive Palmer. And that's in essence why we're seeing the breakouts that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. So yesterday, as Eb said, yes, 5 senators crossed the floor to support a Hanson bill, which would have removed vaccination mandates. We've also got a couple of senators, Liberal senators, threatening to withdraw their vote from government proposals until such time as their demands are met. That's now bleeding into the lower house with George Christensen threatening a similar boycott. At the same time, this morning, we've had coalition MPs debating the government's religious discrimination proposal that has just been endorsed by the coalition party room just a few minutes ago. So will come into the House probably this week or next to be debated, but that's contentious internally, so that's a whole other dynamic. And also we've just, in the minutes before I joined you all, seen a new speaker installed in the House of Representatives. Tony Smith departed that role yesterday. He's retreating to the government backbench until his retirement from politics at the next election. The House has just installed Liberal Andrew Wallace to the speakership of the House of Representatives. And he's got very big shoes to fill after Tony Smith. So we'll see what sort of speaker Andrew Wallace turns out to be. And I think his first test will be at 2 p.m. today.
Absolutely. And it just kind of strikes me, I feel like things are very messy at the moment in politics. We had, government senators crossing the floor, which is not a regular occurrence. Yesterday in question time, the PM got himself into trouble on lying again and had to correct himself or explain himself twice. Katharine, you wrote a whole op-ed about that. Tell me what happened there before we get back into the...
Completely mind-blowing. What just I still actually can't process it. Just very strange. Obviously, Labor is fully aware that these are the final 2 parliamentary sitting weeks for the year. We will then go on some sort of a summer break and we'll return, and the election could be called any time, basically after we return after Australia Day. So the preamble is Labor has been doing a lot really over the last 6 months, but more intensively over the last couple of sitting periods to pin Scott Morrison as a Prime Minister who has real difficulty sort of sorting fact from fiction. The single objective of question time yesterday was to pin Scott Morrison as being someone who tells lies. Astonishingly, the Prime Minister played right into that strategy by giving an account of a text message conversation that he'd had with the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, before departing for his Hawaiian holiday, the infamous Hawaiian holiday. He told the chamber that he told Albanese he was going to Hawaii. That turned out to be completely false. And the Prime Minister had to withdraw it, only a couple of minutes later, and then came back an hour after that to try and clean up what he'd said. It's just sort of amazing. I mean, that you would sort of that you would not recall events of an event of that holiday, which still lives large in the Australian consciousness. This was sort of one of the shorthands of Scott Morrison in popular culture, is the Hawaiian sojourn in the middle of the bushfires. So, perhaps he could have chosen something else to mess up, and that might have been a better strategy than talking about Hawaii, which does 2 things. It reminds people that it happened, and it reminds people that the Prime Minister struggles to separate fact from fiction. So that was a complete mind blower for me yesterday.
And I'm sure it won't be the last mind blower before the federal election, Katharine. But let's get stuck into, if I can make this work. You just don't understand my struggles with technology today. I feel like I've got some kind of force field surrounding me that makes all the tech I come into contact with not work. So here we go. I'm going to try and share this. Can everyone see that?
Yes, well done.
Success. Excellent.
Well done. We all feel you, Dales. We feel you.
I'll see if I can make this go to full.
Even go full screen.
Yeah, but bear with me while I try that. Take us through this first one, Pete, while I try and toggle this to full screen.
So this slide could also be subtitled, "I had to rewrite my Guardian column after I got the results back from the Essential report yesterday." So the golden rule of politics is that Conservative parties have an advantage on the question, which party is better at managing the economy generally. And I assumed the Liberals would have their normal advantage on this, and I'd created a bit of a narrative that Morrison would run for all he's worth to make the next election about the economy. But he's not. At the moment, it's kind of line ball. Well, it is line ball. Sorry, not kind of. 34, 34, 32 undecided. And then that should be a real flashing light for the coalition. And you would have seen over the last week or 2, Morrison trying to find a way into an economic debate. He's had a crack at cost of living, and we'll get to those numbers in a sec. He's also had a crack at this can do versus don't do government, and we also test that out this week. People that have read my stuff in the past will know I've got a construct of looking at economic management, which I call the finger hut effect. Vic Fingerhut is a pollster that's been looking at Western democracy since Hubert Humphrey. So we're talking about the late 60s. And his thesis is that regardless of a party's actual performance, right of centre parties tend to win that question, which party is better at managing the economy, by 10 to 15 points, regardless of the merits, right? Regardless of whether they're in power or opposition. And it's only when you get this kind of alternate formulation that I've placed as the second question there that left of centre parties get in the game. And it's normally a shift from a 10 to 15% advantage to line ball. What we're seeing in this report, though, is that it's actually Labor that's about 10 to 15 ahead on their chosen turf, which is when you put people into the equation. So ensuring the economy works in the interests of everyday Australians. So that's the formulation we've always run as the counterpoint to economic management. So the straw man I was intending to put up was that while Labor was ahead, was behind on economic management, they were in the game when they put people in the economic equation. These results say that they're well in the lead if they can make the economic debate about real things that affect real people. And we can maybe talk about that a bit later, but there is the start of an agenda you're seeing Labor running at the moment. It's got early learning and TAFE to get more people into the workforce. You've got that whole issue around workers' rights, job security and higher wages. And you've also got a growing narrative around building things in Australia. So there is the start of Labor win, or at least engaging in an economic debate for once, not starting, 3 lengths back, entering the home straight. So really interesting. At best, it's neck and neck.
And of course, going into the next couple of questions around the rise in cost of living expenses, we've got here changes in household expenses over the last 6 to 12 months. Petrol's obviously the big one there. Katharine, given that we know petrol prices at the very least have gone up significantly, but they're not the only things, did you find it a little bit risky that the Prime Minister would venture into that kind of territory?
Well, it's sort of interesting, Ed, because these numbers tell us that cost of living questions are salient, and that shouldn't surprise us because cost of living pressures are always salient in election contests. So it's sort of at one level, I guess a more neutral interpretation is that there is a sort of a cost of living campaign sitting out there for someone to capture, because obviously households are as concerned about their expenses as they've always been. And what you asked me about was petrol prices. And it's slightly strange, I think, that it's taken a while really for petrol prices to sort of enter the political consciousness, given how high they are. I think it's a weird lagging indicator of the pandemic because, a lot of people weren't driving during lockdown. So didn't really know until they went to fill up for the first time after an extended period of lockdown.
That was me.
Well, me too. I hadn't filled up my car for ages, and I went to the petrol station the other day and I said, "What? My God, what do you mean it's $1.70?" It's sort of like, anyway. So it's one of those funny things where reality is slightly lagging the political conversation, which is unusual because usually politics anticipates these community conversations anyway. So look, there's a cost of living area there for either side to exploit. As Pete said a minute ago, the very interesting thing, though, is the starting point, that we're in a different starting point to where we would normally be ahead of a conversation about cost of living. And Pete's right. Look, it's pretty obvious from what the Prime Minister's been doing over the last couple of weeks in particular that he's sort of trying to set up a conversation around that. Pete also mentioned Labor is sort of countering with its own sort of economic story slowly. I think that needs to be significantly fleshed out from where it is now. So everybody's sort of circling that contest, that traditional contest. But if these numbers are right, the whole conversation is starting in a different place with voters than where it normally does. So we've all got to adjust our thinking. And that might explain, I'll finish on this note in response to your question. There is this sort of strange dynamic with the Prime Minister at the moment, and I mentioned this in a weekend column, that it's sort of like, I don't think he's entirely sure what the election is going to be about.
Yeah.
In terms of their framing. You can see him casting around on a range of different fronts. as you mentioned, Eb, there was, sort of petrol prices will always be higher under Labor or whatever it was that he said last week. There's been sort of a bit of footsie with interest rates. Like he's kind of market testing a number of different propositions, because he looks to me like a guy looking for a knockout blow and he doesn't know what it is yet. So it's, again, in a circular sense, that leads us back to these numbers and the fact that we may in fact be in a different starting place to where we normally are on this conversation. And if true, that is genuinely intriguing.
Yeah, I'll head back to the slides, but that really struck me too, like trying to struggle to find what's going to be the great cutting through negative argument. And I think he thought he was onto a winner with petrol prices will be higher under Labor, but I don't think he's filled up his own tank of petrol in a while.
Yes, like there's sort of an element in the figures, and I'm hogging the mic here, so I'll just say this very quickly and move on. There's an element in these figures which I'm sure we'll flesh out, Pete, in the conversation, and that is that people are concerned about rising prices. Petrol is the top of the list at the moment, but they are also squaring the circle back to government. They think government has control over these things. So that, again, is a sort of an interesting dynamic when we think about this debate.
Could I maybe, there are two other insights I'd have on this. The first is that the section of the media that Malcolm Turnbull describes as the stenographers have been writing up this "who do you trust on prices" as some genius stroke with echoes to 2004 with Howard. The big difference is that interest rates were low. These numbers say the perceptions of prices is already rising. The other thing I'd say is the last time household prices was effectively prosecuted was actually Rudd from opposition. It's much harder to do it when you are actually in charge and you're presiding over the higher prices. And if you remember, poor old, I won't say poor old Kevin, but they ended up with a whole bunch of really wishy-washy policies to deal with household prices too. Remember, there was Grocery Watch and fuel. Like it was, or the only thing they could do was create a website where you would put prices on. Like that was the limit to the market intervention. And I think a lot of the other results in this week show that people will probably be expecting a bit more than that as well. So it's fine to say I'm going to keep prices down, but how? Because this is a government that, they don't want to be in the way. They want can-do capitalism to run free.
Yeah, and let us know in the chat if you were like me in a lockdown state and got a rude shock when you went to fill up your car, to a full tank at the end of lockdown for the first time in 2 or 3 months, and it cost $25 more to fill up my car. That was what shocked me about the PM prosecuting that petrol prices thing. I was like, my God, that's very risky territory. But let's head back here.
I think just finally on that, Ebony, the other thing that we have seen within some of the demographics is the people who have seen the petrol prices increase the most and are most concerned about petrol as a household expense are old people and people in regional non-capital areas. So perhaps those are the concerns that Morrison is starting to, or the audience at least, that he's starting to prosecute and look towards.
Yeah, I have no trouble believing that those are the demographics that are concerned about it. But the idea that it's going to be better under Morrison when they're skyrocketing seems to be the flaw in the plan there.
Yeah, although this is interesting, in that they're like the respondents actually think government can have an influence. Look at this.
Yeah,
86% of people actually think government can have an influence on household expenses. So again, it's a little bit of a repudiation of that idea of can-do capitalism, leave it to itself and get government out of the way. People, I think particularly after the last couple of years, see an enhanced role for government. So again, it feels like the PM's swimming against the tide at the moment. And I know I do take Katharine's point that he is iterative. He is like me. He goes into research trying to find the winning message. It's just that that's what I'm paid to do, and he's paid to lead the country. But he is looking for a slogan, and he will keep going. And he did it last election too. I don't know if people remember the terrible formulations before he got to the bill you can't afford. There was unaffordable, and it was all this stuff he was trying to land. And he's shameless at throwing out the stuff that doesn't work, and then he comes until he lands on something. So I think that's part of the world we're in at the moment too.
Yeah, I can see we've got more than 850 people on the line with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to move on to the next slide here. Government influence on household expenditure. Take us through this one, Pete.
Well, it's what it says, doesn't it? The majority, or not a majority, most people think there's no difference between the two parties, which makes it a hard thing to actually run as your key point of difference. But when they do think there's a difference, it's almost, I'm going to say, almost half, 50% more for Labor, 37-23. If people want to play at home and have a look at crosstabs, I should also say, and John will show it a bit later, we've got a whiz-bang new website I've just put in the chat where you can click on and see all the different gender and age differences as well, if that's of interest. So, and on a lot of these, the big difference is age, where younger voters just see Labor as a much better economic manager, and it's only the older voters, or otherwise known as my demographic, 55 plus, which is keeping the coalition in the game.
And take us through this slide as well, the role in economy and business.
So there's a little bit here. On the left, we're really testing out that kind of proposition of can-do capitalism versus don't-do government. So we gave people three options. I want government to have a more active role in managing the economy. I think the way the government manages the economy currently is about right, and I want government to have a less active role. Look at that, 62%. And again, in those crosstabs, that includes of coalition voters, and John can help me if I stuff this up, 56% of coalition voters are on that ticket, 70% of Labor, 70% of Green, and 58% of the outliers. So massive... I don't think he's going to be pushing that can do, don't do much longer. I think that one's gone straight out of the market testing into the big round filing cabinet. In terms of the other one, it was sort of more coming up with a spectrum. Government do it on its own, business left to themselves, and government need to work in partnership with business. It's kind of almost like self-evident, but 81%, massive numbers on that one.
Yeah, Katharine, I was going to ask you on that. Pete's got a hunch there that they're going to drop that line, but I wonder if it's like a couple of the other things we've seen the Prime Minister test out, and it's not really for the whole entire audience, it's just for a subsection there. Is that aimed at this anti-government, anti-vaccination mandate crowd? Is that your suspicion?
Yeah, well, part of the reason why you can, if you're why you could look at the Prime Minister with a certain amount of mute at the moment is because it's this this tendency the Prime Minister has to narrowcast. He tends to speak to the cohort of voters whom he thinks he needs to communicate with in any given time, and we're certainly seeing that at the moment. And part of the reason the sort of the political discussion feels a bit off or a bit out of kilter is because the Prime Minister at the moment is very attentive on speaking to the base and speaking to the section of the base inclined to lodge a protest vote at the coming election, sort of as a consequence of the lived experience of the pandemic, where we've had the return of government as a sort of an assertive kind of presence in people's lives. You know, we made the point a moment ago that the difficulty for any government sort of running on a cost of living agenda is in the modern economy. Governments have very limited intervention or scope to intervene in powers. In prices. We won't set a bunch of prices in the Australian economy. That hasn't happened for a very long time, obviously. But we've just been through 2 years where we've had governments very, very present in people's lives, making a bunch of regulations, making a bunch of decisions to, as the Prime Minister was fond of saying, save lives and livelihoods. Australians have reacquainted themselves with the power of government, and this sort of field work indicates that the experience has been reasonably positive. So you would think if you were the Prime Minister, you would campaign on that record at the time where your own trust was sort of, your own trust metrics were high, when your approval rating was high, when the approval of the government was high, when you were streets ahead of your opponent as preferred Prime Minister. You would think that is such solid bedrock for any incumbent to campaign on, If I were the Prime Minister, that's the pocket I'd be sitting in. He's not sitting in that pocket, though, because he feels as though he's lost a section of the base. He's concerned that a proportion of centre-right voters will vote for either Hanson or Clive Palmer or the Liberal Democrats or another sort of small government type party, right? So he is speaking almost exclusively to those people at this point in time.
That's so true, Katharine. He's almost running against his own performance over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And I would have thought those votes come back to him anyway. So why would you be totally...
Well, Peter Lewis, just hit pause on that thought.
All right.
The concern, you're probably right, but the concern in the government, and this has been, I can't remember when I wrote the first column about this. I don't know. It's several months. The concern in the government has been, particularly with the bleed to Palmer, to the UAP. If we think back to the 2019 election, the UAP was enormously helpful to the coalition, enormously helpful. It was like a preference harvesting machine.
But also demolished Shorten, like it just ran the really hard negative. Yeah.
Exactly. Like if we were in the American context, we would describe the UAP as a super PAC for the coalition in 2019. Now, the government doesn't have the same confidence that that Palmer will be supportive, will be helpful to the re-election of the coalition. Interestingly, this morning we've had a preference announcement from the UAP, a simultaneous announcement, one in Brisbane, one in Canberra, where Craig Kelly, who is the federal leader of the UAP, said that the UAP in this election will be preferencing the Liberal Democrats first. And they will be having a ticket that basically is like the One Nation ticket, put the major parties last. That is their current disposition. Now, this is the risk that the Prime Minister is trying to manage at the moment, that there is a big bleed of protest votes to minor parties that do not flow back to the coalition. That's why if you're sitting on this call and you're wondering why the Prime Minister isn't speaking to you at the moment, it's because he isn't. He is speaking to
other people to talk to.
Other people. And it's sort of like, it's just an interesting phenomenon with the Prime Minister, because I think Scott Morrison had moments of this during the pandemic where he sort of broadly understood and tapped into this quality of leadership that we expect in Australian Prime Ministers, that you're a big tent leader, you build a coalition and you govern from there. That is the usual sort of Australian experience. But the Prime Minister, because he thinks like a campaign director, doesn't really buy into that big tent style. He's always looking for a majority, which is 50% plus one. That's all you need in order to win. So the Prime Minister has these periods where he is narrow casting very, very deliberately to certain cohorts of voters. And that's where we are at the moment. But the thing that I find very perplexing is that sets him at odds with his own record. And I think that's a very strange way to conduct yourself. But I do I think the Prime Minister is a very, very clever political operator. I assume there's a strategy here. Of course, the strategy may not succeed, but I assume there's a strategy here.
Can I just say one more thing about this cunning plan? Setting up a fight for states when support and regard for state governments is tracking about 20% ahead of regard for the federal government, again, seems brave, idiosyncratic. I don't know, but it doesn't seem to be rooted in the numbers that are presented in this week's Essential Report or any week's Essential Report.
Yeah.
We better let Eb get a word in.
Yeah, sorry, Ebony.
That's all right. I was just going to take us back to the last couple of
we
can go to questions from the audience. So the next one that we've got here will take us back to Glasgow, Katharine, and I wanted to touch on this because there's a couple of questions in the Q&A about this, but we can see here, Pete, quite strong support for more ambitious 2030 targets.
Yeah.
That's also backed in by elements like the Business Council of Australia. We really did see a big push towards ambition there.
The only thing I'd say about this number was, as you can see, unlike most responses, it adds up to 100. We did a forced choice. That's sometimes you can do that if you just want to know if they've got to choose one way or the other where they go, and you take away don't know, don't care out of it. I'm going to defend John's construction of the question there, Katharine, even if you don't. Sorry, John.
I would never defame John Remmington. With all his respect, I'm just being completely transparent with people watching the webinar today. That is a forced choice.
Yeah.
That's not the way we normally set up questions like this. Anyway, Pete, as you were saying.
Oh, I've said.
You've said.
The next one.
The only other thing I would add, okay, if you're exhausted, if you've exhausted what you wanted to say, the only other thing I would say, apart from forced choice, is that while this is heartening for those of us who really know that we have to take action now, that we can't just keep on the trajectory that we have been on. And I do think climate is alive and present in this contest, and it's very interesting how boxed in the Prime Minister now is on this issue. All of these are pluses. I just encourage this audience to understand that it doesn't, that we also need to bear in mind, you know, one of the reasons climate action is very difficult to land in this country is because of the distribution of voters who are opposed to climate action and who are opposed to this transition. And that's the problem we're facing, that these voters are clustered in particular seats. The coalition has been able to weaponise the issue in order to talk to voters in those particular seats. Now, look, is this the election where that changes? Well, gosh, I hope so, but you know.
The one thing I will also add in our Whizbang new website that I put in the chat, if you go to age, 75% of 18 to 34s want more ambition. So yes, geographically we've clustered, but I can see if you say that first time voting cohort is at 75% on this issue, there will be a tipping point where the government can no longer divide and obfuscate. I'm not sure if we're there yet, but every election we're getting closer. It's just almost like a race with planet destruction and voter demographic. If we can just catch up in time, right?
And Pete,
if only this were funny. Yes.
Just take us through this last one on attitudes to freedom of speech, and then we'll get to the question.
Okay. So look, there is a bunch of statements that I think we asked in 2019. It was just to set up for the religious freedoms. So, and I guess it says to everyone that it depends how you ask the question, right? If you say it is only right that people consider what they say affect others, basically nice manners, 70% agree. There should be stronger laws to protect people who express their religious views in public. It's down to 37%. Look, I think it's one of those issues that is there again as a little bit of a micro-targeted campaign with a view to exercising particular religious groups and getting everybody else into a bit of a state. Oh, you were meant to show one more thing, our new website address.
Oh,
before
sorry.
we come up for air, because I wanted John, because this is a big deal. I know we're running a bit over time, but we've built a new website, everyone. I might have said it a couple of times.
I can't.
Oh, don't worry. John can probably put it up later.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll put it in the chat. It's very pretty. You can do lots of things with it.
Just that last slide, July 2019, I believe, was when the issue of freedom of speech was involving Israel Folau. So just as a comparison, and particularly over time, we just haven't seen any shift there. It's not like the attitudes of people have changed a lot at all in the past 2 years, and before obviously the debate of that bill. But yes, just a quick look. Please check out our new website. It has gone up in the chat a few times. We really want to hear from you about what you think of it, how you use it. We want to kind of share and be more transparent with some of these numbers that we're talking to you about today, and give you an opportunity to look at them. So we have voting up there with a lot of demographics in there, more than I think we've ever shown before. We've got all the latest questions in there. And yes, please let us know what you think of it and what we can do to improve in the future as well.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go to questions from the audience now. Don't forget to type in your question in the Q&A box there if you've got one for the panel. Pardon me. Katharine, this first one's for you. Was the view from Glasgow of Australia's climate action as negative as we hear, and what are the implications for the election?
Yes. Look, to respond to the question sensibly, I need to obviously disclose I travelled with the Prime Minister to Glasgow, and we were on the ground for 48 hours in a conference that spanned 2 weeks. So my observations are within the time frame that I was on the ground. And that's all I can report to you. In terms of, are we viewed as negatively as you read? Well, yes, we are viewed as negatively as you read. That's why you're reading it. It's we are firmly established now in a cohort of countries that are pushing against the grain in terms of ambition, particularly in the medium term. Obviously, allies and partners welcomed Australia's commitment to net zero by 2050. That is an important commitment that the Prime Minister has made. It does acknowledge that the transition that we are making now is inexorable, and that is a shift on the part of the Australian government. But the focus of the Glasgow summit was action to 2030. And the sort of greatest tell of that was when the Prime Minister stood up to make Australia's national contribution at the summit. He didn't mention net zero. He basically dwelled on Australia's projected overachievement for the 2030 target. So, look, the Prime Minister knows we remain under pressure from allies and partners to increase our level of ambition by 2030. The Nationals have basically vetoed that. Now Liberals are regrouping around a pre-election push to get Scott Morrison to signal a higher target for 2035 rather than 2030.
Just keep pushing out that goalpost.
Oh, I know. It is what it is. We haven't covered ourselves in glory over the last several COPs, and we didn't cover ourselves in glory in Glasgow either.
Yeah, I will say when Katharine mentions the kind of company that Australia keeps now, she means countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, all the other petro-states who have resource-rich economies. But also, Katharine, just not to leave everyone massively depressed, as we often do on climate change, it was the first COP where fossil fuels were really squarely in the crosshairs, and coal got a mention. The UK is trying to consign coal to history. There was a big pledge around reducing methane emissions.
Yeah.
And as a veteran of many COPs, that's really, they're normally not mentioned at all. So that was a huge step forward.
And also the presence, like the very, it was sort of startling for me that the presence of Australian fossil fuel executives at a COP was sort of amazing. And we had the whole parade of the Australian fossil fuel industry at the COP. And you're right, Eb. Look, the election of Joe Biden has, notwithstanding the American president's difficulties in legislating his agenda domestically, has been a fillip for action, or at least pledges, more ambitious pledges internationally. And look, there is a centre of gravity in the world now around making this transition. And as the Prime Minister acknowledged, which is part of the reason for Australia's shift, global capital's made the choice. Global capital is not making a bad bet. So, look, over the medium and long term, the news is positive. It's just I always, ask people who are concerned about this issue to bear in mind the electoral realities in Australia that explain why we've been in the position that we're in. That's it, without bringing people down.
You've got to be honest about what the situation is as well. Pete, the next one here is for you. It's from Alan Collegado, who asks, what might be the single most important issue on which the 2022 election could be decided? Any hint of that, of a strong contender in the polling so far?
I think Morrison's character is emerging as one of the key issues. It's baked in. Every day it's being reinforced, and I think Labor has worked out the lines, doesn't take responsibility, doesn't always tell the truth. And it's interesting. I've always joked that normally when you run a negative campaign, you need to take a bunch of quotes out of context and put them in those ripped newspaper ads and everything, and no one quite believes you. Morrison is such a good marketer that he's actually marketed his own negative campaign. He doesn't hold a hose. It's not a race. And now I guess Macron's freelancing into the Labor Party ads as well. So that's the negative. Then the big thing, and I think I think both sides will agree this will not be an election about what's just happened. It's what comes next, which then goes back to, well, what is the contest of ideas? Katharine's right. Labor's getting there, but they need to put their proposition in front of people, recognising there are the parameters around what they can do because Morrison is such an effective negative campaigner. So I think what you'll find is tax is one lane that they're not going to get too far out of. Climate is another lane they're not going to get too far out of. And then they've got to tell a story about the future with a funded economic plan dealing with energy transition. So it's not easy. And I think from the coalition, it's just going to be that old chestnut, every election is about time for a change. Well, don't risk it. And they're going to dig up every speech Albo ever made when he was a student activist, decades of running in the left to try to convince people that Albo is a clear and present danger to the Australian economy and their own living standards.
Katharine, Pete mentioned there the issues with the Prime Minister's character and lying. Labor's obviously tried that before with John Howard, and he flipped that, made it about trustworthiness. But it strikes me he had quite a different record in voters' minds than perhaps Scott Morrison has with some of those other issues that Pete mentioned about holding a hose during the bushfires and being away in Hawaii, which he's just unhelpfully reminded us all of. Do you think that issue of trustworthiness, that it's going to be more difficult for Scott Morrison to make that argument that Howard prosecuted successfully because he doesn't have that record to stand on?
Look, it's sort of it's a bit of an unknown, I think, at this point. It's sort of like character questions are sort of necessary but not sufficient to change governments. It's sort of it's hard to say with certainty. Like instinct and a couple of decades of experience tell me that we've reached a bit of a tipping point on Morrison's character for a bunch of different reasons. I think you've landed somewhere where the political discussion has sort of seeped into popular culture in various ways, and you can see that that's occurring. But whether that's sufficient to change the government, I think, is moot at this point. In terms of answering the question, which is what does the data show us? Well, if we sort of look at the whole data as well as the survey this week, we come back to cost of living is a salient issue. It's sitting there to be weaponised potentially by one side of politics or another, as is always the case in elections. Climate is clearly there as an issue because of the factors I was talking about geographical distributions. How does that play out? Well, I guess we'll see how that plays out. And Labor, while I'm not, there's a lot of criticism around about Labor's small target strategy, I can actually see where Albanese has been positioning them. I don't think the strategy's dumb at all, but I don't think you can win an election crouching behind a couch. And so, as Pete said a moment ago, Labor's going to have to put some more flesh on the bones. Then we see, getting back to the Prime Minister hunting for a knockout blow, which is clearly what he's on the hunt for, how the contest proper evolves once there's more in the public domain for Morrison to work with. And it sounds like I'm avoiding answering it. It's just that there are a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
Like, if there was an election held tomorrow, if we were off to the polls tomorrow, my money would be on a hung parliament as the landing point at this point in time. But it's unclear when the election will be, whether it's early next year, whether it's towards winter, we don't know. And there are a lot of variables between now and then.
Yeah. The next question I've got here is probably for you, Katharine, a bit. It's from Melina Smith, saying, we saw some ugly protests here in Melbourne. Why do some politicians not condemn their actions? Is this going to be an ongoing election strategy next year with some federal parliamentarians?
No, I hope not. Look, it's obviously in a democracy, we've all got fundamental rights, although our rights aren't very well codified in Australia, but we do have rights, obviously, to express our views, and people are entitled to express views about what's just happened in this country and the world over the last 2 years. And there are genuine weighty issues there to discuss and weigh, freedom and liberty and the role of the state and whether there's sufficient scrutiny and accountability. All of this is important, and I wouldn't minimise anybody's right to express their views. The difficulty about the sort of tone of some of the protests has been this sort of overlay of menace and violence. And if we look at situations in comparable democracies like the United States and the United Kingdom, the trajectory of that has been terrible. And I don't think it's hard for leaders worthy of the title to get up and make very, very firm statements about, basic civic values and the limits of people's, people's expression of dissent. I don't like to get into security issues because I just don't like to bandy about and talk about that. But their MPs across both sides of Parliament have been reporting privately over the last couple of months an escalation of risk around them, around their electoral offices. Some people sort of broadly associated with the anti-vaccination cause, been bailing up in offices, refusing to leave. Threats have been made. This is a potentially very dangerous environment, particularly where people seek to profit on disaffection and this sort of dissent. So it's not a game, it's not a seminar, it's not a drill. These are literally, these are very, very important times, febrile times, contested times, difficult times. People need to conduct themselves in a way that sort of, in a manner of governing rather than in a manner of campaigning. And that's what we saw the Prime Minister really fail to do last week. He drew the line in the wrong place. And I think he realised that subsequently as the days went on, and he sought to clean that up. But if we've got parliamentarians, politicians of all stripes looking around, looking for their main chance in the knockout blow in the election, they're not thinking about now. They're not thinking about the consequences of now. And we need to think about those consequences very carefully, because there's some very scary scenarios associated with some of this behaviour that none of us want to think about too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I might just mention a couple. So the things that I've noted is not only, I think it was earlier this year or last year, the security agencies warning that the far right was using some of this sentiment that is genuinely held around anti-government mandates, anti-vaccination, anti-lockdowns to try and recruit people and radicalise them. We've seen in the Northern Territory, the Chief Minister, Michael Gunner's family had to be evacuated from their family home because of anti-vaccination protesters, I think, making threats and posting his home address. And obviously what all MPs must be concerned about is where this ends up. And we've seen 2 UK politicians assassinated in the last 5 years in different circumstances, but as Katharine said, there are consequences to stoking these kinds of things, and that's what we definitely want to avoid here in Australia. The next questions I've got are around from Heather De Cruz here around Raina McIntyre reporting that there might be a 4th wave of COVID, judged by what's going on in Europe. And given that so many in our community get their news from social media and the uncertainties, how do panelists see the political risks in the new year when it comes to, I guess, more waves, more lockdowns, those types of things? Pete, I might come to you first on that one.
Well, there is an ongoing issue around the notion of calling mission accomplished because the reality of the pandemic is an unknown. So it's a big risk to say it's all over, and Morrison seems to be taking that risk at the moment. I guess on the upside, our vaccination rates are near the highest in the world. Like, apart from every single person in Canberra, it's kind of it's hitting 90 in most places. And I guess that's the other point to that previous discussion about the anti-vax movement. We've got to remember, this is not a movement that is building a groundswell. It is a rump, and the vast, vast majority of Australians are not denying the science on this. Yeah, there is a huge issue, there is danger, but there is also massive danger for any political party that is seen to be going to there rather than to where mainstream Australia is, which they've been through 2 years of incredible disruption. They have done what's required to make our society more resilient. They will want to have rules in place in the places they go. They're 90% plus that are vaccinated. We'll want to have a degree of security and a sense that if there is another wave, we have got systems in place to keep ourselves safe. So I think the dynamics really are, the uncertainty means that no one should really be playing silly buggers. Both sides of politics did well when they followed public health advice. That should still be the roadmap to anyone that wants to, build a successful political base.
Katharine, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just quickly, I think Pete's point is right, that we do have this institutional defence because we do have very high vaccination rates. But one of the striking things actually from my brief visit to the other hemisphere a couple of weeks ago was that Europe, of course, was coming out of their summer into the winter months. And it was striking as an Australian just coming out of lockdown how COVID normal things were in Italy and in Britain, because they've had a long summer where obviously they've been, consistently high cases, but life has returned to more or less normal. Now we're heading into the winter months. Europe is about to head into where we've just come out of, if that makes sense. And there's always the concern about new variants and variants, God forbid, that are resistant to the vaccinations, all sorts of things. So I guess it's the sort of simple point is that that the Prime Minister might want government out of our lives. I doubt he does, given he's the government. But let's just pay that point for a moment. That he's sort of channeling the fatigue of people about these special circumstances that we've existed in, and fair enough. But the point is that this is a highly dynamic and fluid situation. Literally, within the space of 6 months, government may need to be very present again in order to save lives and livelihoods. So anybody who wants to sort of freeze themselves in aspic in moments in time because it's convenient, I do think that's quite risky, because we are not out of this thing yet. We're learning to live with this thing, which is where we need to get. We're moving from pandemic to endemic. We're learning to live with a virus that kills people, sadly, does kill people. That's a journey that will play out. But of course, winter has its own circumstances in terms of infections. Winter hasn't been cancelled, sadly. We will hit another one. So anyway, we just got to be realistic about, how long it's going to take, I guess, to go back to life that we would consider actually normal, as opposed to COVID normal. We're a distance off that yet.
Yeah. The next question here is from Gil King, and I might send this one to you, Katharine. Is Dutton preparing for another tilt at the leadership, or just playing a supporting role as warmongerer to shore up the national security, national interest narrative? I might point out that's the question. That's not us saying that. But
that's a very colourful turn of phrase right there.
We have seen him obviously kind of commit Australia to war against China if they happen to invade Taiwan, but that's certainly not what the US and China have been talking about. Is it just rhetoric ahead of the election, or is he serious?
Okay. The first point is, is Peter Dutton sort of looking cheerful? Well, I can report that Peter Dutton was spotted twice yesterday smiling with spontaneously smiling. And those of you with long memories and remembering the sort of events where Malcolm Turnbull was shown the door by his colleagues in 2018 may remember that the then leadership aspirant Peter Dutton told us all that he wanted to smile more, and he wanted to be a more relatable person, and he'd been constrained by his hard man portfolios, and that he intended to smile more. And we were treated at that point to some Peter Dutton smiling. Anyway, we smiles were cited in the final 2 sitting weeks. I'm just saying that for full disclosure. Perhaps he was just happy. Perhaps he's seeing events sort of turning in a favourable direction. I'm being a bit flippant. Look, probably the Prime Minister's right till the election, but this is a strange place and who knows. In terms of what Dutton is actually doing, the complaint in the government is that he's not doing enough. The complaint in the government is that he's leaving Scott Morrison out there. He's doing his sort of, hard man Queensland 2GB routine, which obviously, someone in the government always has to do that, and Peter Dutton likes doing it, therefore he's the designate. But the complaint in the government is that he's, Morrison's, it's hard work. It's hard work being an incumbent government seeking a fourth term. Best chances if everyone turns up, does their best, try to convince voters that, re-elect the government for the fourth term. And the internal complaint is that Peter Dutton's leaving Scott Morrison right out there. So anyway, there's a couple of thoughts for you: smiling and leaving the Prime Minister right out there.
Pete, it is about to be the killing season, but we haven't really heard the usual rumblings about leadership. What's your thoughts there?
I think that Morrison still will have the Messiah complex. He basically ran a one-man re-election campaign last time, and I think all those that want to believe in miracles will believe in it again. I think the context's different, but I'd find it very hard to see him. There's the final last words. He's gone, because I've just said find it very hard to see him being rolled.
Yes.
None of us.
Sorry, that's the absolute kiss of death on him, though, isn't it?
None of us like predictions anymore.
Just one more quickly, Eb, just on that, like I was mentioning before about how Morrison's narrow casting to the base, and my working thesis for that is they're concerned about protest votes leaking to the right. The other time Liberal leaders do signal to the base, though, is in during times of leadership duress. That's the other time you see this quality. So if you're a very suspiciously minded person, perhaps you could have a different interpretation to me about why he's signalling to the base. I prefer, probably for my own self-protection, to stick with the protest vote theory. I do think that's the more plausible theory.
And of course, he's also got the growing number of independent candidates, the
Indeed.
Climate 200,
Yeah.
all with fantastically memorable names from Zali to Allegra now, which is almost dealing with the fact that the Liberals haven't really been able to provide a career path for females for a long time. So they've all kind of started coming forward as independents. But that is another constraint on where any Liberal leader goes at the moment. So
Katharine, I will just ask you about that, because there's a couple of people in the questions asking about the Climate 200 independence in particular, but that is something that the government will have to contend with, that it doesn't normally, although it has for the last couple of elections. So on the one hand, it's trying to keep the Nationals in the tent, it's trying to win Queensland, but on the other hand, it's got this independents running in key inner city seats where the view is they haven't done enough on climate. How much is that going to be troubling the government ahead of
I think, look, we've got to keep it in proportion. There's really only a handful of seats in the country where this will be a real thing. But I think there are some seats where this is a real thing. I think the Liberals will be very worried about Wentworth now that there's a candidate in the field. Obviously, they've already lost Warringah, and Zali Steggall feels pretty dug in there, although obviously it'll be a contest if the Liberal Party ever pre-selects a candidate for Wentworth. That's for Warringah, just saying. Anyway, so yeah, look, it's certainly an issue that it's one issue the government's got to manage. They've got to think about spending in seats that should be safe, and that obviously depletes efforts elsewhere. But yeah, we're talking about a handful of seats, but it's pretty important, though, if where we end up is a hung parliament. They're pretty important seats. So anyway, we've got to see how that rolls.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, everyone. If you are on the line and you, like me, are a Ken Barron, then don't forget to head on over to our website. We're going to have our final Politics in the Pub for the year, and the first one since we've emerged from lockdown. And it's going to be launching Pete's book, written with Jordan Giao, about the Public Square project. That'll be really exciting. That's next Wednesday. That's right, isn't it, Pete?
I think so.
December.
1st of December. That's not next week, I don't think. And Katharine,
it is next week.
No, next Wednesday.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Time is a flat circle and has no meaning for me anymore. Katharine will be along there for that as well. So please head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to check that out. We'd love to see you there in person. Thanks so much for all your wonderful questions today. I'm sorry, as usual, that we couldn't get to them all. And thanks to our regular panelists, John Remmington, Pete Lewis, and Katharine Murphy. We'll see you again next week in Canberra if you're going to be there, and 2 weeks from now on our last pole position for the year if we don't see you next week. Thanks very much, everyone. Stay safe.
All right.
Bye.